I paid for my son's degree. I don't mean I helped. I don't mean I contributed. I mean I carried it. Every semester, every fee, every quiet sacrifice that never made it into a thank you speech. And I wasn't invited to his graduation. I didn't hear it from him. I didn't see a card. I didn't get a call. I found out the same way strangers did. Scrolling, half awake, thumb moving without thinking, until my body froze before my mind could catch up. Before I go any further, if you've ever given someone everything without asking for credit, only to be erased when it mattered most, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe. These stories are for the ones who loved quietly and paid the price anyway. I wasn't always this calm about it. It took time to learn how to sit with a pain that doesn't scream, but settles. Years ago, when my son first told me he wanted to go to college, I nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. As if I hadn't already done the math in my head. As if I hadn't already felt the weight of it press into my chest. His father had passed not long before that. There was no inheritance, no safety net, just a small life insurance payout that disappeared into rent, food, and time. Still I said yes, because that's what mothers do when they believe in something more than themselves. I worked longer hours, took on shifts no one wanted, learned how to smile through exhaustion so he wouldn't feel guilty. When the first tuition bill arrived, my hands shook opening it. Not because I didn't want to pay, but because I knew this was only the beginning. Every semester after that followed the same pattern. He would call nervous. "I hate to ask, Mom." And I would stop him before he could finish. "I've got it," I'd say. Every time. Books weren't cheap. Parking passes weren't optional. Late fees didn't care about good intentions. Paid them all. Sometimes I skipped meals. Sometimes I told myself I wasn't hungry. Sometimes I pretended my coat was still warm enough for winter. I never told him those parts. I wanted him focused, free, unburdened. That was my job, I thought. When he met her, his future wife, I welcomed her with the same open heart I had always offered him. Cooked extra. Questions. Listened more than I spoke. She was polite. Distant but polite. I didn't push. I've learned that love doesn't need to announce itself. Just shows up. Years passed. Phone calls became shorter. Dates less detailed. I told myself it was normal. Young lives move forward. Old ones learn to make room. Then came graduation season. I saw neighbors posting photos. Cousins celebrating nieces and nephews. Caps thrown into the air. Parents crying in bleachers. I didn't assume anything. Waited. Weeks passed. No mention. I told myself maybe his school did things differently. Maybe it was delayed. Maybe he was overwhelmed. And then one morning everything changed. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, coffee gone cold beside me, when a photo filled my screen. My son. In a cap and gown. Smiling in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. The caption wasn't his. It was hers. "So proud of my husband today. Graduation day." My heart didn't shatter. Sank. Slowly. Like something heavy slipping beneath the surface where no one else could see it. Check the date. That day. I wasn't invited. Not forgotten accidentally. Not left out because of space. Excluded. I sat there longer than I should have, staring at the photo, wondering how something I had funded with years of my life could happen without me. I didn't cry. I didn't call. I didn't ask why. Because some answers change things forever. And I wasn't ready yet. Instead, I closed the app and stared at the wall, listening to the quiet hum of a life I had built around someone else's future. That night I slept poorly. Memories kept surfacing. Him at the kitchen table studying late, me pretending not to be tired. His excitement over passing exams, my relief hidden behind encouragement. I thought of every "I've got it" I ever said. And for the first time I wondered what it had cost me beyond money. By morning something had shifted. Not anger. Awareness. I realized I had spent years teaching my son how to stand tall, but never taught him how to look back. And that realization hurt more than missing the graduation ever could. The days after his graduation passed without a word. No message. No explanation. Not even a casual, "You'd have been proud." At first, I told myself not to read into it. Silence has many meanings, and I had learned over the years to choose the one that hurt the least. But silence has weight when it stretches too long. I went back to work, made my meals, folded laundry the way I always had, neatly, carefully, as if order could keep everything else from falling apart. People at work talked about their children, promotions, achievements, proud moments. He nodded, smiled, said very little, because pride, when mixed with grief, becomes something fragile. One evening, I pulled out an old folder from the bottom drawer of my desk. It wasn't labeled. It didn't need to be. I knew exactly what was inside. Receipts, tuition payments, bookstore invoices, housing deposits, parking permits, years of proof quietly stacked. I hadn't kept them out of bitterness. I kept them because somewhere deep down I was afraid of forgetting what I had done, if no one else ever remembered. I flipped through them slowly. Each page was a season of my life. Each number was a choice. There were months where my bank balance dipped lower than it ever should have. I remembered the panic, the careful planning, the relief when I managed to make it work anyway. I never once asked him to pay me back. Not money. Not gratitude. Just presence. That was all I had wanted. A few days later I finally heard from him. Text. "Hey Mom. Things have been crazy. Hope you're doing okay." I stared at it longer than necessary. Hope you're doing okay. As if the moment hadn't already passed. As if nothing important had been missed. Type. Deleted. Typed again. I saw the graduation photos. Congratulations. There was a pause before his reply came. Thanks. Just that. No apology. No explanation. I set my phone down and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Later that week, I overheard a conversation at work that stayed with me. A younger coworker was complaining about her parents being too involved. They think just because they helped pay for stuff, they get a front row seat to my life, she said, laughing. Something in my chest tightened. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold. I thought about involvement, about boundaries, about how easy it is to rewrite generosity as entitlement once you're standing on the other side of it. I remembered how often I had stepped back on purpose. How often I had chosen not to interfere, not to ask, not to expect. And I wondered, had I stepped back so far that I disappeared? The following Sunday my son called. His voice was cheerful. Distracted. "We're thinking of having a small dinner next weekend," he said. "You could come by if you want." If you want. I agreed because I wasn't ready to say no yet. When I arrived, the house was full. Her family mostly. Conversations overlapping. Laughter loud and effortless. I was polite. Observant. No one mentioned graduation. At one point, I noticed a framed photo on the shelf. The same one I had seen online. Cap and gown. Male. A moment preserved. There was no photo of me anywhere. Not because I needed proof, but because absence leaves patterns. During dinner, someone joked about student loans. How lucky they were to have help. My son laughed. I said nothing. Later, as I stood to leave, he hugged me briefly. The kind of hug that ends before it begins. "Thanks for coming, Mom." Smiled. Driving home, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't angry at him. I was disappointed in myself. Not for paying for his degree. Not for loving him fully. But for never teaching him the cost of that love. I had raised him to succeed, but not to see. And now, standing at the edge of his adult life, I understood something that took me years to learn. You can give someone everything, and still be treated like you gave nothing at all. That night I made a decision. Not to confront. Not to demand. Not to explain. But to stop disappearing. Because love, when it's only given quietly, is easy to forget. And I was done being invisible. The decision I made that night didn't announce itself loudly. There was no dramatic vow. No tears in front of a mirror. No speech rehearsed in my head. It was quieter than that. It showed up the next morning when I woke up and realized I didn't feel the usual urge to check my phone for messages that weren't coming. I made breakfast slowly. Ate it at the table instead of standing by the sink like I usually did. I noticed how quiet the house had become over the years. Not lonely, just unused. I had spent so long arranging my life around my son's future that I had never stopped to ask what mine was becoming. At work, I turned down an extra shift for the first time in years. The words surprised even me when I said them. I won't be able to take that on. No explanation. No apology. Just a sentence. That evening, I went through my closet and pulled out clothes I hadn't worn in a long time. Not because they didn't fit, but because they felt like they belonged to a woman who no longer mattered. I tried one on. I looked fine. Better than fine. And something about that hurt more than I expected. Few days later, my son called again. This time he sounded rushed. "We're planning a trip later this year," he said. "Just wanted to let you know. Not invite. Inform." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "That's nice," I said. There was a pause. "You okay?" he asked, almost as an afterthought. "I am," I replied. And this time it was true. After the call, I sat quietly, thinking about how often I had mistaken being needed for being loved. I had always been useful, reliable, available. But usefulness fades once people stand on their own feet. Love, real love, requires recognition. Weeks passed. I stopped offering help before it was asked. Stopped checking in every few days. Stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fix. And something interesting happened. The more I stepped back with intention, not hurt, the more space I felt returning to me. I started walking in the evenings again, the way I used to before life became about deadlines and tuition payments. The air felt different when I wasn't rushing through it. One afternoon I received an unexpected email. An alumni newsletter. A school. My eyes scanned it casually until I reached a familiar name. My son. A short feature about outstanding graduates. I read it slowly. His achievements were listed. His future plans. A quote from him about hard work and perseverance. There was no mention of me. I closed the email without anger. Recognition, I realized, isn't something you can force into existence. Later that night, I found myself looking at the old receipts again. Not with pain this time, but with distance. They weren't evidence anymore. They were chapters. And chapters don't ask to be reread forever. The following weekend, I ran into a neighbor who asked how my son was doing. "He graduated recently," she said. "You must be proud." Smiled. "I am," I said. And I meant it. But pride no longer came with expectation. That distinction changed everything. When my son finally noticed the shift, it came in the form of confusion. "You've been quiet lately," he said during one call. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied calmly. He waited as if expecting more. There was nothing else to give. After the call ended, I realized something important. I hadn't stopped loving him. I had stopped shrinking for him. And there is a difference. That night, I wrote something down in a notebook I had kept empty for years. Love doesn't require self-erasure. I closed the book and turned off the light. For the first time since the graduation, I slept without replaying moments in my head. Because I was no longer waiting to be invited into a life I had already paid for. I was beginning to build one that belonged to me. The change didn't come from a fight. Came from absence. Not the kind that slams doors or blocks numbers, but the quiet kind that simply stops reaching first. I stopped being the one who reminded. Stopped being the one who asked. Stopped being the one who softened every sharp edge before it could touch him. And slowly, my son began to feel it. He called one evening, his voice lighter than usual, almost uncertain. "Hey, just checking in." I smiled to myself. Not because I felt victorious, but because I recognized the sound of someone realizing a balance had shifted. "I was in the neighborhood earlier," he continued. Thought about stopping by. Waited. You didn't? Asked gently. No, he said. I figured you might be busy. Busy. That word used to belong only to him. I was, I said. But that's okay. There was a pause again, longer this time. We spoke about small things. Weather. Work. Nothing important. And yet, when the call ended, I felt something important had happened. He had noticed. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. From him. I held it for a long moment before opening it, surprised by how heavy it felt for something so light. Inside, the words were careful, polite, almost formal. He thanked me for everything I'd done over the years. Mentioned how busy life had been. Said he hoped we could catch up properly soon. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a bridge extended without addressing why the river had grown so wide. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't rush to reply. Not out of punishment, but because I finally understood that immediacy was a habit I no longer needed. During that time, something unexpected happened. I was offered a promotion. Not a glamorous one. Just more responsibility, better hours, a sense that my work, my presence, mattered somewhere. I accepted without hesitation. The day I signed the papers, I realized I had stopped measuring my worth by how indispensable I was at home. That night my son called again. I got your message. I got the letter I sent, he corrected himself awkwardly. Did you receive it? Yes, I said calmly. And I read it. Another pause. I was hoping, maybe we could have dinner sometime, he offered. My treat. My treat. I smiled softly. I'd like that, I said. Let me know when you've figured out your schedule. There it was. I didn't rearrange my life to fit into his calendar. I let him step into mine. When we finally met weeks later, he looked different. Older. More tired. Less certain. He talked about work stress, expectations, the pressure to succeed. About how fast everything had moved since graduation. I listened. I always listened. But this time I didn't interrupt. Didn't reassure. Didn't rush to fix. At one point he stopped talking and looked at me. You've changed, he said. Yes, I replied. How? I thought for a moment. I learned to stay, I said. Even when I wasn't being invited. He looked down at his plate. For the first time, there was discomfort in his silence. When we parted that evening, he hugged me longer than usual. Not tight. Not desperate. Just present. As I walked home alone, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't waiting for him to say the right words anymore. Because I had already said them to myself. And that was enough. After that dinner, something shifted, but not cleanly. Change, I've learned, doesn't arrive like an apology wrapped in flowers. Comes unevenly, awkwardly. Sometimes too late for comfort, but still early enough to matter. My son began calling more often. Not every day. Not even every week. But the calls were no longer rushed. He asked real questions now. How have you been sleeping? Are you still working late? Did your knee ever stop hurting? Small questions. Ordinary ones. But they carried something unfamiliar, attention. One afternoon, while I was cleaning out an old drawer, I found the receipts. Tuition payments. Bookstore invoices. Housing deposits. Neatly stacked. Carefully labeled. I hadn't kept them to remind him. I'd kept them because back then, order was the only thing I could afford. I sat on the floor and let myself remember. The second job I took without telling anyone. The nights I pretended not to be hungry. The way I smiled at his graduation photos, cropped so I wouldn't be visible in the background. I never told him how close I came to selling my wedding ring. Because love, I believed, should be quiet. That evening he came by unexpectedly. No warning. No plan. I was nearby, he said again, the same phrase as before, but this time he meant it. He noticed the open drawer. The papers spread out. What's all this? He asked. I hesitated. Then I answered honestly. My life, I said. On paper. He picked up one receipt, then another. His forehead tightened. These are, for my degree. Yes. How much did all this cost? He asked. Shrugged. I never added it up. That was true. Because numbers didn't matter then. He sat down slowly, papers still in his hands. You never told me it was this much. I never wanted you to carry it, I replied. His voice dropped. But you carried it. Yes. For a long moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice cracked, just slightly. I didn't invite you, he said. Because I thought you wouldn't want the attention. I thought you preferred staying in the background. I looked at him. And for the first time I corrected him. I stayed in the background, I said gently. Because that's where I was placed. The truth landed between us. Not like an accusation. Like a fact that could no longer be avoided. I was ashamed, he admitted. Of how much I owed you. Of how much I depended on you. It felt easier to pretend I did it alone. He nodded. Most people do, I said. Until they're old enough to understand what alone really costs. Tears filled his eyes. Not dramatically, not suddenly. Just quietly. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't wave it away. I let the apology breathe. Because some words need space to become real. I don't need repayment, I said finally. And I don't need ceremonies. He looked up. I just needed to know, I continued, that when you stand tall, you remember whose shoulders lifted you. He nodded. Slowly. That night after he left, I stood by the window for a long time. Not crying. Not smiling. Just standing. I realized something then, something important. Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the wound. It means no longer bleeding from it. And for the first time since graduation day, I wasn't bleeding anymore. The apology didn't fix everything. Apologies rarely do. What followed mattered more. The next week my son showed up again, this time with a notebook under his arm. I need help, he said. Not money. Not advice about work. Help with remembering. He sat at my kitchen table and asked me to tell him things. About when he was little. About the years before college. About the moments he'd never thought to ask about. He wrote while I spoke. Not typing. Writing. Slower. More deliberate. Why are you doing this? Yes. He didn't look up. Because I don't want my success to be built on amnesia. That word stayed with me. Amnesia. 4 years I had been invisible not because I wasn't there, but because I'd been forgotten. We talked for hours. About the night he had a fever and I walked 3 miles in the rain to get medicine. About the semester I skipped rent to pay his lab fees. About the job interview I missed because his car broke down. I told him everything, calmly without drama. Not to punish him, but because truth deserves witnesses. At one point he stopped writing. Why didn't you ever tell me you were struggling? He asked. I smiled, a tired smile. Because you were busy becoming, I said. And I didn't want to be the weight that slowed you down. His jaw tightened. You weren't a weight, he said. I reached across the table and touched his hand. I know that now, I replied. But back then I was just trying to survive. That night he hugged me, really hugged me. Not the quick kind. The kind that lingers. Something else changed after that. He started introducing me differently. Not just as my mom, but as the reason I could go to school. The strongest person I know. The one who made all of this possible. The words felt strange. Too big. Too public. But I didn't stop him. Because sometimes dignity means allowing yourself to be seen. One afternoon he handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed invitation. Not a graduation one. Lecture. He had been invited to speak at his university. About perseverance, about first-generation success. And at the bottom, in small letters, guest of honor, my mother. I want you there, he said. Not in the back. Not hidden. Right next to me. I hesitated. Old habits die hard. What if people ask questions? Yes. He smiled softly. Then we'll answer them. Together. The day of the lecture, I wore my best coat, the same one I'd worn to my second job interviews years ago. When he took the stage, he didn't start with achievements. He started with a story. He told them about the nights I worked late, the sacrifices I never named, the degree that wasn't earned by one person alone. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. And for the first time, I didn't shrink. Afterwards, strangers thanked me. Students hugged me. Parents asked how I managed. I answered honestly. I did what love required, I said. Even when it cost me everything. On the way home, my son drove in silence. Then he said something that surprised me. I don't want to run ahead anymore, he said. I want to walk with you. I looked out the window. Streetlights passing slowly. I'm not asking to lead, I replied. Just don't leave me behind. He nodded. I won't. And for the first time I believed him. Change doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, and waits to see if you'll trust it. After the lecture, life didn't suddenly become perfect. My son didn't transform overnight into a different person. But the direction changed. That mattered. He started calling more. Not to update me but to ask. What do you think? Would you do it this way? Does this feel right to you? For years, I had been the woman with answers no one requested. Now, my silence was finally being invited into the room. Still, something inside me stayed cautious. Love, once ignored, learns to protect itself. One evening, he came over with his wife. She stood in my doorway, unsure. Not hostile, just distant. We had never fought. We had also never truly spoken. She sat across from me at the table where my son once studied for exams I paid for. Her hands folded to keep them from trembling. I owe you an apology, she said. Not rehearsed, not dramatic, just honest. I thought keeping things simple meant keeping them small, she continued. I didn't realize I was erasing you. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said, I don't need to be centered. I just need to be acknowledged. Her eyes filled. I see you now, she whispered. Seeing is harder than loving. It requires humility. That night I learned something important. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing not to weaponize memory. Weeks later, my son invited me to dinner with his colleagues. Almost said no. Old fear again, the fear of being out of place. You belong there, he said gently. You always did. At the restaurant, someone asked me what I did for a living. Pause. I used to answer with apologies. Oh, nothing special. I just worked. I stayed home. This time I said. I raised a man who didn't quit. The table went quiet. Then someone smiled. That sounds like everything, they said. For the first time I didn't feel smaller for speaking. Later that night, as we walked to the car, my son asked a question I hadn't expected. Why didn't you ever ask for recognition, he said. I stopped walking. Because love isn't a transaction, I replied. And because I didn't want gratitude. I wanted your future. He nodded slowly. But now, I added, I want respect. And I will not apologize for that. He didn't argue. He understood. That was the boundary. Not loud. Not angry. Just firm. From that day on, I stopped shrinking to keep others comfortable. I let my voice take up space. I let my presence be known. Not because I was bitter, but because dignity, once reclaimed, should never be returned. Some people think parenting ends when children grow up. They're wrong. It ends when the parent finally remembers they are human too. And I had remembered. Respect changes the temperature of a room. You feel it before anyone says a word. When I walked into my son's home now, I wasn't moving through spaces that tolerated me. I was entering places that made room for me. That difference was subtle but profound. He began asking me to stay longer. Not as an obligation, as a choice. One weekend they invited me to spend a few days with them. Just us. No events. No announcements. First I thought it was guilt. But guilt rushes. This was patient. On the second evening my son cooked dinner. He kept glancing at me, nervous. What? He asked. I'm trying to do it the way you used to, he said. Without rushing. Without shortcuts. Smiled. That comes from practice, I replied. And from caring who you're feeding. Later, his wife brought out old photo albums. Not the curated ones, the messy kind. Pictures of me younger than I remembered. Tired. Smiling. Standing in the background. I didn't know you looked like this, she said softly. Neither did I. We sat together, turning pages. No apologies this time. No explanations. Just acknowledgement. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I was upset, but because something inside me was finally settling. 4 years I had lived in survival mode. Now there was space. Space to feel pride without pain. Space to rest without guilt. The next morning my son asked if I would help him with something. We drove across town to a small building I recognized immediately. The community center. I want to fund a scholarship here, he said. For students like I was. He nodded. And I want it named after you. I stopped walking. No, I said quietly. He looked surprised. I didn't do this for my name to be used, I continued. I did it because it needed to be done. He thought for a moment. Then help me choose who it helps, he said. Let it be yours that way. That felt right. We spent the afternoon reviewing applications. Stories that sounded painfully familiar. Kids carrying entire families on young shoulders. Dreams balanced on fragile finances. One letter caught my attention. A student wrote, "Someone believed in me when they had nothing to gain." I folded the paper carefully. That one, I said. On the drive home my son was quiet. Then he said, I thought success would erase the past. I shook my head. No, I replied. It reveals it. That evening when I packed my bag to leave, his wife hugged me first. Please don't disappear again, she said. I met her eyes. I won't, I replied. But I won't chase either. She nodded. That balance, presence without pursuit, felt like freedom. As I stepped outside, my son walked me to the car. I'm proud of you, he said. Pause. No, I corrected gently. You're grateful. And that's better. He smiled, understanding. As I drove away, I realized something important. I hadn't just reclaimed my place in his life. I had reclaimed my place in my own. When people talk about closure, they imagine doors slamming shut. Mine didn't. It opened. Slowly. Without noise. After that weekend, I returned to my routine, but it no longer felt like a retreat. Felt chosen. I woke up early not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I made tea and sat by the window, watching a world that no longer rushed past me. For the first time in years, my days were not shaped around waiting. Waiting for calls. Waiting for visits. Waiting to be remembered. I had stopped orbiting someone else's life. One afternoon I received an email from the university. An invitation. They wanted me to speak at a small gathering, not as a benefactor, not as a symbol, but as a person. The topic: invisible labor and the cost of care. I almost declined. Old instincts again. Then I remembered the boundary I had set. Said yes. When I stood at the podium, my hands were steady. I'm not here because I did something extraordinary, I began. I'm here because millions of people do ordinary things that no one applauds. I spoke about late nights. About unpaid sacrifices. About love that doesn't leave receipts. The room listened. Not politely. Intently. Afterward, a young woman approached me, eyes wet. My mother sounds like you, she said. I never thanked her. Go home and do it, I replied. Today. That night my son called. I heard about your talk, he said. They're asking me how it felt to hear my story told by you. Smiled. And? Yes. He exhaled. It felt like standing in the truth without armor. I liked that. Truth doesn't need defense. Weeks passed. Our relationship settled into something real. Not idealized, not fragile. He didn't overcompensate. I didn't overgive. We met in the middle. One evening he sent me a message. I'm teaching my daughter about gratitude today. My heart paused. I hadn't realized how much that mattered. Generational silence ends somewhere. Maybe with a conversation. Maybe with a choice. I wrote back. Teach her presence. Gratitude will follow. Later that week I walked past a bookstore and stopped. I hadn't bought a book for myself in years. I went inside. No purpose. No guilt. Chose one slowly. At the counter the cashier smiled and asked, "Is this a gift?" I shook my head. "It's for me." The words felt powerful. At home I wrote my name inside the cover. Not as proof of ownership. As recognition. I wasn't just someone's mother anymore. I was a woman with a life that continued. And that was the quiet victory no one could take from me. Legacy isn't something you leave behind. It's something you live differently once you understand your worth. After everything that had happened, people started treating me with a gentler respect. Not because I demanded it, but because I stopped refusing it. There is a difference. My son didn't call as often out of guilt anymore. He called because we enjoyed talking. Conversations moved beyond updates and logistics. We talked about ideas. The future. He asked me once, "Do you regret anything?" I thought carefully before answering. "I regret confusing endurance with invisibility," I said. I thought being strong meant being silent. He didn't interrupt. "I won't teach my daughter that," he said quietly. That was enough. One afternoon I was sorting through old papers when I found a receipt, a tuition payment from years ago. The amount didn't matter. What mattered was the date. I remembered how scared I had been then, how close everything had felt to collapsing, and how I had paid anyway. Not because I was brave. 'Cause there was no other choice. I folded the paper and threw it away. I didn't need proof anymore. Later that week, my son invited me to a small family gathering. Nothing formal. Just people. When someone introduced me as his mom, he corrected them gently. "This is the woman who taught me how to stand when I wanted to sit down." No spotlight. No speech. Just truth. I didn't blush. I didn't deflect. He nodded. Receiving respect is a skill too. On the drive home I realized something surprising. I wasn't replaying old hurts anymore. The past had loosened its grip. That doesn't mean it disappeared. Just stopped controlling the present. At home I made dinner for myself and ate slowly. I cleaned the kitchen without rushing. I didn't fill the silence with noise. I enjoyed it. There is a peace that comes when you stop auditioning for love. When you realize that worth doesn't increase with sacrifice. It exists already. Before bed, I sent my son a short message. "I'm proud of who you're becoming." He replied almost instantly. "I'm proud of who you are." I placed the phone down. That exchange didn't erase the past, but it balanced it. And sometimes balance is the most honest ending there is. Some endings don't arrive with relief. They arrive with understanding. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm, but I was no longer living inside it on autopilot. Every choice felt intentional now, even the small ones, especially the small ones. I stopped measuring my days by how useful I was to others. I began asking myself a quieter question. Does this honor me? That question changed everything. I still loved deeply. I still showed up. But I no longer disappeared in the process. One afternoon my son came by unannounced. He brought nothing with him, no papers, no plans. Just himself. We sat in the living room, sunlight stretching across the floor. "I've been thinking about something," he said. I waited. "When I didn't invite you to my graduation," he continued, "I thought I was protecting my new life. I didn't realize I was cutting myself in half." I didn't respond right away. Some realizations deserve silence. "You forgave me," he said. "But you didn't forget." "No," I replied calmly. "I remembered in a way that let us move forward." He nodded. That distinction mattered. Before he left, he asked if I would keep something for him. He handed me his graduation cap. "I don't want it stored away," he said. "I want it where it belongs." I placed it on a shelf in my home. Not as a trophy, as a reminder, not of sacrifice but of survival, growth and choice. After he left, I stood alone for a moment. I felt no bitterness, no triumph, just clarity. I hadn't been invited to a graduation once, but I had been present for every unseen step that made it possible. And now I was present for myself. That was the real ceremony. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Love doesn't mean erasing yourself. Strength doesn't mean staying silent. And dignity doesn't ask for permission. I didn't raise my son to owe me. I raised him to remember. And in the end he did.